for Q&A, again, feel free to send in questions in the audience and out on the live stream. So first of all, I have a question for Stanley. You had, well, let me give you a background on myself. Last year, or earlier this year, I had some reporters at the Weather Channel. They drove me around southern Georgia where Hurricane Michael had struck, and you mentioned Hurricane Michael earlier. And after showing, it was tremendous devastation, and it was heart-wrenching. And after showing me that devastation, then I was posed the question, do you still doubt climate change? So let me present that to you, because you, as you mentioned and showed, you lived through Hurricane Andrew. Your house was destroyed. Your family was placed in danger. Do you still doubt climate change?
Well, actually, I don't doubt climate change. The climate is always changing, but on various timescales. But I started laughing immediately with that because it goes back to how I started my talk. The fact we've always had hurricanes. We've had hurricanes disasters. There's been other Category 5 storms that have hit the coast. Always very, very devastating when you have a Cat 5 storm. Michael was especially devastating because it was an area where you get a lot of storm surge, a lot of water flooding. Miami with Andrew, we did not because of how everything was shaped there. Camille, you got a lot of storm surge. The 35 Labor Day storm, you got a lot of storm surge, just overwashed the Florida Keys and killed hundreds of people. So you're going to get devastation, and we're going to have strong hurricanes in the future. Like I said, even if you make carbon emissions zero, even if the climate never changes again, you're going to have hurricanes. So that's nonsense. Every disaster has to be blamed on climate change in their eyes.
And that's an excellent point, because if you listen to the mainstream media reports and the climate alarmists, they would have us believe that strong hurricanes never occurred before the 1940s or 1950s or any of these other events. So,
well, they'll say, oh, but these are stronger. And that's, like I said, dealing with the changes in the observations.
Sure, absolutely. Anthony, you mentioned homogenization of the temperature readings and the reports. And with your surface stations project, and you showed some slides from there, you showed how many of the stations, and in your project you documented numerically how the vast majority of stations are not very reliable, how they are corrupted by compromising factors such as asphalt nearby or urban development. So my question is, when folks in the federal government homogenize the data, which they tell us is to get a better report, a more accurate report, what steps, if any, are they taking to make sure that when they homogenize, that they're accentuating the temperature readings from the pristine stations rather than accentuating the temperature data from the much more voluminous corrupted stations?
Well, the simple fact of the matter is they're not. The algorithms are using all of the data, the bad data and the good data, and that's been my central argument. Why should we continue to use the bad data? They know it's bad. In fact, this year, NOAA published a study done at Oak Ridge Laboratory where they actually recreated what I was talking about. They put out temperature sensors at a distance away from a building and a parking lot, and they looked at the data over a period of years. And they discovered exactly what I've been saying, that the proximity to the building made a difference in the temperature, particularly the nighttime temperature. And so they verified what I've been saying. But that hasn't, even though that's in the peer-reviewed record, it has not made it into the way that NOAA is dealing with temperature data. They're collecting all of it. They're trying to fix all of it. My best advice is, don't try to fix bad data. Just throw it out. Gavin Schmidt of NASA GISS, one of the most respected climate scientists in the world, has said that we only need about 150 stations or so to monitor the entire world. At one point he said that. And so that's true. So we got about 114 good stations in the United States based on our analysis. Why not just simply use them to look at what the change in temperature has been over the last century or so, instead of trying to throw in all these other stations? It's a simpler process. And if this were forensic science, for example, forensic science would say, well, we've got all this bad data, it's been polluted, let's throw it out. And that's what would happen in a court of law. That would not be admissible. Yet in climate science, we're still using this bad data. And so we just need to stop using it and go for the good data.
Excellent. Thank you, Anthony. Before I present the next question, which we have from someone watching online, Jim and Keeley, is it okay for me to sit down so I'm not holding my tablet? Excellent.
And can I add a comment to something
By
Anthony
all
said?
means, feel
Yeah,
free for
because,
these questions.
Because let me say, not every data reanalysis project is biased or mistaken. I'm very proud of some of the stuff going on with NOAA, with the Hurricane Center, Hurricane Research Division. And the Hurricane Reanalysis Project has been led by Chris Lancy, who we mentioned many times, who's got a sober head on his shoulder with all this stuff. In fact, his resignation letter from the IPCC is kind of legendary because he pulled out because of all the nonsense he saw going on there. But they are looking very, very carefully, without bias, at the past data, because the problem was the way, rather than have a thermometer, which might be in the wrong place, but it's still the same kind of device, the ways we measured the hurricanes through the years have changed so dramatically. So he goes back, this laborious project he's been working on for decades, and looks at storm by storm, all the data, and some they find out, because someone asked me the other night, some they do lower the strength of the storm, and some they increase. It all depends on the circumstances. So it's a very unbiased way of looking at it, and that's good reanalysis of data.
So I have a question here presented from, I believe, someone in our live audience. There's an agenda to destroy hydroelectric dams across the United States. For example, the largest land destruction project on the Klamath River in California and Oregon. Can you please share your concerns about destroying these multi-beneficial, renewable, clean energy resources? And I guess I'll direct it first to Anthony, as you're in California. These are emissions-free power sources. People are trying to destroy them. What are your thoughts?
Well, California doesn't even count dam generated electricity as renewable. They exclude it from their renewables mission equation. So that's part of the reason. They don't think that dams have renewable energy, when in fact they do. There's a lot of people in California that want to return California to its pristine state, so to speak. And there's even been talk of taking out the dams in Yosemite. Hetch Hetchy Reservoir, for example, which services San Francisco, was built exclusively to service San Francisco. They're talking about getting rid of that. Well, what is San Francisco going to do? I don't know. But we'll be back to pristine. It'll be perfect. But I'll point out, before we had dams in California, we had massive flooding. The year 1862 in California saw the entire Sacramento Valley flood, literally. In downtown Sacramento, there was 6 to 10 feet of water from a massive storm system, a river of air, or they call them atmospheric rivers, that lasted a couple of weeks in January from 1861 to 1862. And so they had no way to control the water flow, no way to retain water. And so there was disaster everywhere. And so, as far as I'm concerned, getting rid of dams and the benefit that they provide, not just the energy, but the control of water, is not just foolhardy, it's stupid.
Can I comment on that? For those who
course.
have not seen Frozen 2, I don't want to give away any plot points, but there is a how many in this room have seen Frozen 2? There's a very strong plot point regarding a dam. And when you think of it, I realize the agenda they put into that movie, but I won't give it away, but there's something that they're pushing with the whole idea of attitude towards dams.
And the question and Anthony's comments just call to mind for me how when you see news reports about how other nations are doing so much to bring renewable energy online, in almost every other nation in the world outside the United States, they're including hydroelectric power as a renewable resource. So we hear about how China or other nations are increasing their renewable power generation by so much, and yet they won't give United States energy sources, power sources, the benefit of referring to hydropower as renewable, even though it fits the definition of a renewable resource. And similarly, in 2015, at the COP meeting, that would have been, I'm not sure of the number, but we at the Heartland Institute attended, like we're doing here this year in Madrid. And I sat in on a workshop that was presented by an environmental activist group, and one of their speakers was a minister from India. And the environmental activist group was promoting the fact that here we have this Indian minister who is talking about how much India is doing to increase. I think the pledge was to make their energy or electricity supply 30% renewable by 2030. My numbers could be off a little, but I think that was the essence of it. And what was buried in the talk was that they were doing this almost entirely by, or excuse me, when I say renewable, I got that wrong. Carbon-free was the term they used, so without emitting carbon dioxide. And what was buried in the talk was that they were reaching that level almost entirely through building new nuclear power plants. And of course, the environmental activist group, once it was pointed out, when I did point it out, that that's how they're getting there. Well, they didn't want to hear that at all because they oppose nuclear power. And yet, for messaging purposes, to make it seem like the rest of the world is so enlightened and doing the right thing while the United States is not, they're counting nuclear power as a wonderful thing, which there's nothing wrong with that, but we should be doing that in the United States as well. So that's a fantastic question. Another question we have here from the chat. This one, again, we'll start with Anthony. Why do all local TV meteorologists hype climate change?
That's a good one.
You're a meteorologist. Are you hyping climate change?
No, in fact,
many
I was
do.
one of the very first to de-hype it. I was back in the, interestingly enough, I started out as a climate change proponent in the early 90s. In 1990, I did a program with the National Arbor Day Foundation because I was in the control room of my TV station in 1988 in June, and I watched Dr. James Hansen give his testimony where he's talking about the 3 different models and the problems that we're going to have with temperature. And I was convinced back then that we had a real problem. And I became an environmental climate activist, really. In 1990 and 1991, I did this project with the National Arbor Day Foundation to encourage viewers for TV stations to plant trees. And we created some graphics and some videos and so forth to send out to TV stations. CBS News helped us distribute it. And it went out to several hundred TV stations, and they then showed that to their viewers on Arbor Day with the encouragement of go plant some trees. And there was a place they could get these mail-order trees, these seedlings, inexpensively. And so we planted something like 250,000 trees each of those 2 years. And then I got to thinking about it with the former climatologist for the state of California who settled in my town, retired there. He showed me some of his data, and that's when wait a minute, I started thinking about them. So yeah, I was de-hyping it early on, but today it's getting popularized because it's a mission, It's like I had a mission back then when I was on the other side. They've got a mission too. They want to do something good. There's nothing wrong with doing something good, but the problem is that they're hyping something that isn't necessarily a crisis, even though people call it a crisis or a climate emergency. I will say that there's still a lot of television meteorologists who won't hype it at all. And the reason is they know that about half of their viewers are going to be upset when they start pushing this stuff because, despite the claims of 97% consensus on climate science, the public has nowhere near that kind of consensus. And so if you start talking about climate change on the air, you're going to aggravate a good percentage of your viewers. So it's not everywhere, it's in some places.
We could take a whole hour on just that one question because it's important for people to understand what's going on behind the scenes. And what Anthony said is very, very important because I, as a meteorologist, when I first heard the Hansen stuff and the AGW stuff, I thought, well, sounds reasonable and basically accepted because it wasn't my area of expertise and I didn't spend much time looking into it. And then I saw how the hurricane data was being manipulated in this particular thing. It was around 2004. Kevin Trenberth and some others were saying wild things. Chris Lancy and I would look at each other. It's like, what are they talking about? There's no good research for this. That's one of the key reasons Chris resigned from the IPCC. And so I remember that moment of thought where I said, I wonder if they're doing this stuff with the other data too. And finally, when I looked into it for myself, I was shocked at how blatant the distortion, the lies. I mean, it was like pulling the wool off of our eyes. Same thing happened with Dr. Neil Frank, longest serving director of the National Hurricane Center. He kind of accepted, and then Dr. Bill Gray, who some here know, called him one day and said, Neil, look at the data for yourself. Neil did. I liken it to the scene in The Wizard of Oz. You got to look at it in the light of global warming, climate change. The scene in The Wizard of Oz where Toto pulls back the curtain on the wizard. Before then, they're shaking in their boots, and there's fire, and there's green, and all this kind of stuff. And he pulls back the curtain, and immediately the wizard pulls the curtain back and says, pay no attention to the man behind the curtain. But it is too late. And that's how it is for us. Once the curtain gets pulled back, we see this stuff. I have talked to TV meteorologists. Actually, my nephew is the chief meteorologist at a station in Colorado Springs right now, and was in Santa Barbara. But the issue is, I spoke to a number of top networks, top markets, at a conference, and I shared this kind of stuff with him. It wasn't the main focus of my talk. It was really about hurricanes, but I talked about this stuff, and I said, bet you most of you cannot share this on the air, because they have producers, and they have people over their head. And one time, Chris Lancey and I were both interviewed for a special on NBC local affiliate in Miami. So it was a global warming special, climate change special, whatever they called it back then. And we were talking about hurricanes. Everything was so biased. We contacted the guy who did it, because we know these guys. And he said, by the way, we should warn you that the network has declared this coming month as a month to push this stuff.
My goodness.
So they're being given marching orders to do this. And
month.
remember Brian Sussman, the story that he was a chief meteorologist, TV meteorologist in San Francisco, and he was being pushed by, I forgot who it was back then, Dan Rather, one of them, that he had to present this stuff, and he said no. He looked at the science and said no. So this is a lot of agenda going on behind the scenes, why the media is so biased.
And I can empathize with the person asking the question, because oftentimes I will see a report on the local news, and the meteorologist will hype some global warming connection to a weather event that's occurred since recorded history.
To every severe weather event.
And so I understand where it can seem like they're always pushing it. But here's something that's interesting, and I think very important for people to understand. The American Meteorological Society is the only body, the only science body in the United States, or excuse me, in the world, the only science body in the world whose full membership has been polled on climate change issues. And we talk about consensus. When the question is asked of the American Meteorological Society, has the planet warmed in the past century, they overwhelmingly say yes, as do virtually all climate realists. We've presented that data ourselves. During the past century, yes, temperatures have warmed. Next question, have humans played some role? Well, according to AMS members, the vast majority say yes, humans are playing some role, as do virtually all climate realists. And it's on those two meaningless questions that we're told there's a vast majority, the 97% consensus, because they're only asking those two questions, which mean nothing, because that's not in dispute. But when the AMS, when the full body, the only body to be asked these questions, was asked, how concerned about human-caused climate change are you? The number was just over 30%. That's the question that counts. And if you want to say there's a consensus, and instead of talking about facts, talk about a show of hands, the consensus is that we're not creating a climate crisis. That's what counts. I think we have time for one more question, two more questions. All right, two more. I have one here from the live stream. Thank you, Jim. Question is, how do we turn the tide of the relentless propaganda by the UN climate industrial complex, aided by the media, educators, politicians, and dishonest scientists? Well, let's stick with, how do we turn the tide of getting the truth out? Anthony, Stanley.
Well, the simplest way is to shut off the funding. I mean, literally, that's about the only real solution out there. I mean, these folks are true believers. They don't care about what the data says. They only care about what they believe the data says. And so, and it's all about the next grant, the next funding source, the next paper that gets funded, the next study. Eisenhower warned us of this, that he made his famous speech when he left the presidency in 1961, and he talked about the military-industrial complex as a big danger to the United States, and he was right about that. But just a couple paragraphs later, he talked about the scientific complex. He said that there was a danger of the nation's scholars becoming beholden to money, and this was because science changed dramatically from what it used to be before World War II, and then World War II came along, and then the bomb and all this other stuff. What happened is that science used to be done a lot by donors and other kinds of things. At universities, there was small studies, smaller funding, patrons of the arts, patrons of the sciences, those kinds of things. And then World War II comes along, and there was this absolute necessity to beat Japan and beat Germany and come up with the bomb. And the government threw incredible amounts of money at science. And science became addicted to this starting then. It lasted through the 50s and continues today. That's the problem we have. And I will tell you that in the realm of climate science today, unless there's a problem they're not going to get funded for it. I mean, try to go fund a paper that says, well, we've had a little bit of warming, but it's no big deal. Don't worry about it. We'll adapt. That's not going to get funded. So shutting off the money is really the only way.
Let me ditto that, because I know that for University of Miami, Rasmus campus, Rosenstiel campus, which actually Fred Singer had started that many years ago, I heard from a scientist over there. He said if you would cut off the climate, and we mean specifically this type of climate studies, climate funding, this place would probably collapse. And I don't know how accurate that is, but it's a huge chunk of the money. I'm always amazed when I see different projects come along, how much money is thrown at this particular thing. And why do you see, they say, yeah, but there's so many papers published. To publish a paper, you have to have money to do the grant and to publish the paper and to hire the postdocs and everything like that. You throw a lot of money, you get a lot of papers, period. But my other thing on convincing people is one heart at a time from Heartland, but one group at a time. Heartland has just done, this is no flattery, a phenomenal job in bringing together scientists, policymakers, other experts to talk about this stuff. And you can go to the heartland.org site and go to the bottom, go to the climate conferences, and see hundreds and hundreds of talks for the past 10 years about these kind of subjects. And I'm just so thrilled to have been a part of it and be a part of it now. And that's convincing a lot of people. Because, listen, when I disagree with it, with some climate alarmists, scientists, I'm going to be specific, scientists, sometimes all they do is throw back names. You know, those people are stupid. I don't believe that. I said, I'm a scientist. That's not how you convince me. Show me your data. Show me why you disagree. And healthy science, I know you would agree, is sometimes bickering back and forth. I mean, forget the climate stuff.
It can be a blood sport.
Oh, yeah, I have a time, I was in my office at work, and I had two people from my project screaming at me in my office that I was wrong about a certain thing, and I knew I was right. And I finally contacted someone in D.C. They did what I suggested. They found the problem with a certain hurricane forecast model, and tremendous improvements came. And so when people say the climate science is all settled, that's nonsense. That's not good science. We fight back and forth on this stuff all the time. But I agree with people. I make my own little handout. I direct people to the Heartland site. I've sent this link out for these talks to hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of people, and Facebook and emails. So that's what I encourage everybody else to do. That's one of the ways. And believe me or not, scientists are coming around. I mentioned Dr. Judith Curry, who was one of the co-authors on that Webster paper that I so hate. And she turned around on this. She speaks out now strongly on the side we're talking about. I hope you have her at a conference someday for Heartland. And so it's talking to people bit by bit, and scientists' eyes are being opened, the curtain's being pulled back on many, many people. So let's keep up the good work, and Heartland, keep up the fantastic work.
Well, thank you, Stanley. I think we have time for one more question. And this one, I'm not sure if this is from live audience or chat, but it is for Stan.
Uh-oh.
Yeah. How many storms or sets of climate data have been adjusted downward? It seems every time it is always worse statistically. That trend is very unlikely.
Well, I really encourage people to look at my talk again, because I really covered a lot of that. And like I said, we're doing a reanalysis project, but I emailed them just yesterday and got a response back from someone at the Hurricane Center, Andy Haugen, and basically said some of the storms up, some down on intensity, all depends on the circumstances, and they're very, very careful with it. So, but it depends when you have other people. There's a paper by Kerry Emanuel where he did exactly the stuff we're talking about. He did some stuff that knocked down the overall energy from the storms earlier and increased the ones later, and sure enough got this tremendous trend. And he was challenged by Dr. Chris Lancy in a response, published response. So there's all sorts of stuff going on both ways. But by the way, I'll just mention, as you know, there's so many good questions online. Sorry we couldn't, I apologize to the streaming audience, we couldn't get to all of them, but thank you all for watching.
Thanks for watching this video. Please subscribe to our channel and consider donating to the Heartland Institute to support more vibrant free markets, greater individual liberties, and more videos like this one.